So we have two fantastic speakers. The first one is going to be Pete Peterson. He's actually the Dean and Senior Fellow at the Pepperdine University School of Public Policy. And he's trained over 2,000 government officials in how to lead more effective public meetings and to make government more responsive. He does serve on the board of the Public Policy Institute of California, the California League of Cities, Institute for Local Government, and California Forward. His perspective today is going to end up focusing on how things have changed and government's response. And I'm going to let you completely expand on that, but that was my shorthand of what we talked about. So things are changing and government needs to respond, and so there's things that we can bring up that government should know about. And then Jennifer Lilley, I know her through the City of Brea. Whenever we introduce ourselves in Newport Beach, Brea. So y'all know I'm from Brea, but she began her career in the public sector and has been working as a land use planner for a very long time with the Fullerton and Brea. Did you have a question, Bruce? No, okay. She found her niche in the consulting arena more than 23 years ago, right? Okay, yes. And 10 years ago. And she's been working with professionals in the land use arena, environmental, public engagement services, and she's also worked clearly with public agencies and nonprofits. So she enjoys a productive dialogue, which is fantastic. I think that's what we're aiming to learn about today. And that can be achieved any number of ways through community outreach, strategic planning, training, visioning, or career coaching. So she's got a fantastic resume as well, but she is the city planner for Brea right now, and she's doing an amazing job. So those are our two speakers. Pete will go first, then Jennifer will go next.
It's great to be with you. Again, I'm Pete Peterson, Dean of Pepperdine School of Public Policy. So you have that right, policy at Pepperdine, which is why I used to like to have about 10 feet of space whenever I'm introducing us. But it is great to be back in Newport. As I was mentioning earlier, this is where my wife grew up, and my in-laws live over on Lido. She's a Harbor High graduate, and it's always great to be back down here in Newport. So again, the work that we do and the work that I do at Pepperdine is training and consulting with government officials to do something that they often weren't trained to do in graduate policy school, and that is finding ways to better engage their residents. I speak to a lot of municipal government audiences, and unfortunately I have to give a mea culpa that part of the problem we have in our government-citizen relationship is that schools of public policy like mine have had a perspective that we're about training and preparing government experts that then go out and tell the public what to do and how stupid they are. This is obviously not working, and this is why you're all here. But as part of my mea culpa, I see as part of my penance to be training and consulting with government officials in finding more participatory ways of engaging our residents. And so I want to get into a couple things here, and I know Jennifer, who does a lot of this work already from the government side, is going to go into some more detail. But just to quickly roll through my agenda for this afternoon to ask whether public engagement is a fact. It is not too far-fetched to say that if you go to most municipal government conferences today, and even looking at the curricula of graduate policy schools, one of the things that's changed dramatically just over the last 10 years is a greater emphasis put on how can we as government officials better involve our residents in policy making. And I think that's because when you look at so much of the survey work that goes on, our levels of trust in our governing institutions are at all-time lows. This has not gone beyond or past the notice of many people that are working in government. And so, much to their credit, those bright lights, and Jennifer is certainly one of them, are looking at more creative ways beyond the usual council and commission meeting, beyond public comment, which, as we'll explore here in a couple minutes, is really one of the great ironies in our relationship with government. That our point of contact often is public comment, which is really one of the worst forms of public engagement there can be.
Hear, hear.
You don't get a chance as the public to learn and receive, And usually those in government are just looking at their watches, waiting for the public comment period to be over.
So right.
Right?
Yeah.
So what we're going to be examining here is really a trend that we've been seeing over the last decade as governments and also the increase in technology have changed the government-citizen relationship in ways I think it's important. To look briefly at why this is tough work to do and tough to do well, and then finally to close with the roles that you must play to host an effective public process. So,
You can do the space bar.
oh, you can go right here. Great. So you can wonder whether this is a fact. This is a snippet of articles from various government magazines and even including the Washington Post here just over the last year and a half. So everything from the Stanford Social Innovation Review with their article, Community Engagement Matters Now More Than Ever. Governing Magazine, which as you might know is one of the leading magazines that those in local and state government read, how citizens can have a genuine voice in policy making. This great piece from Planet Zen, which is a municipal planning blog, what I learned when an angry group destroyed my public meeting. Here, the Washington Post, these civic experiments are getting citizens more involved in governing themselves. And again, as one who heads up a policy school and we're preparing the next generation of public leaders, I have to say one of the things that's so encouraging is to see the growing amount of coursework that's now being incorporated into policy school curricula, and to go to municipal government conferences and to see all the breakouts and speakers who are focusing on how we can better engage you all in making policy decisions. So I wanted to borrow a quotation out of this article, which again, anything that I cite here, I'm happy to send along links to these articles if you're at all interested, but I thought this was a particularly poignant piece. The Stanford Social Innovation Review is really seen to be one of the leading journals on how governments and citizens are interacting with one another. They did a study under this title, Community Engagement Matters Now More Than Ever, in which they looked at a series of policy decisions at state and local government levels across the country and found that even the best policy decisions ran on the rocks when government officials didn't take the time to engage their residents in the beginning. And so I pulled out this quotation. I'm sorry it's kind of text saturated here, but just to cover it. Data-driven practices and programs hold great promise as a means for making progress against seemingly intractable social problems. But ultimately, they will work only when community members are able to engage in them as leaders and partners. As policymakers, elected officials, philanthropists, and nonprofit leaders shift resources to data-driven programs, they must ensure that community engagement becomes a critical element of that shift. So again, as a policymaker, one of the things I think we've had such a problem with in graduate policy programs is we think as long as we come up with a right answer that fits on an Excel spreadsheet, then obviously the public is going to understand it and take it as gospel. And what we see in articles like this and so many other case studies is you can actually have what objectively could be called the best policy outcome or solution, but if you haven't taken the time to actually engage residents to customize that solution for where you live and work, you stand a great chance of taking what could be a great policy idea and completely messing up the process. So I wanted to cite some of the challenges that you all have. We worked with the League of California Cities to conduct the largest survey study of California public sector officials, local, county, and state, on their feelings and opinions of public process. We surveyed 900 public sector officials across the state, and these are the results I'll go through in what I call the good, the bad, and the ugly. First, the good results. 85% of respondents say, quote, their views of public engagement have changed since their careers began. Important note here, of the 900 officials we surveyed, their average time of service was 22 years. So of the 900 who had 22 years average of service, the vast majority saw that their relationship with the public had changed since their careers began, and a majority of that 85% saw a more positive relationship developing with their residents. Secondly, 77% of respondents, quote, are interested in hearing more about public engagement practices that have worked in other places. So there's also a desire to learn how to do this work better. But I have to touch on the bad and the ugly. 76% say their public meetings are, quote, typically dominated with narrow agendas. 64% say that their public hearings, quote, typically attract complainers and professional citizens, whoever they are. Maybe citizens who get paid for this one. 69% say, quote, a lack of resources and staff could stand in the way of a deliberative public engagement approach. And 80 to 85% had negative responses to if you had a word or phrase to describe the public, what would be the first opinion, word, or phrase that went off in your mind? So, as was mentioned in my introduction, I've trained about 2,000 public sector officials in how to do good public engagement. And I ask that question. When I say the word, the public, what is the first word or phrase that goes off in your head? And it's usually negative. I've done this all over the country. And then that becomes really the pivot point in the training seminar, in which I say, okay, I usually put their answers up on a piece of one of those big Post-it note sheets, right? And I say, okay, look at all these words. We're here to learn how to do public engagement. This is how you think of the public. How are we going to do this, people? Right? And so one of the things that we really try to get across is that maybe the problem isn't the public. Maybe it's not even the government. Maybe it's the way we usually talk to one another. Now, I learned this most acutely from this woman, Gail Goldberg, former director of LA City Planning. We were convening a conference at Pepperdine University on sustainable planning, and I was moderating a panel that she was on around what is the role of the public in making planning decisions. And I featured her quotation up here, and I remember it as it was yesterday when she said, when I asked her, so Gail, for the city of Los Angeles, for your planners, what is the role of the public in making these decisions? And she turned to me and she said, we at the planning department always put people up in front of the public who are the least prepared to be there. Now, what she didn't mean was that her planners didn't have expertise in building heights and setbacks and EIRs and the different technical aspects of planning. But when that expertise met a public that actually had a different opinion of where that decision, how that decision was going to affect them in their daily lives, in their own neighborhood, they had neither designed a process that could incorporate public feedback, nor had they learned the skills of even asking the right questions to facilitate a conversation with the public. It's what I call public engagement 1.0. You sit there and listen, you're the public, I'm the government official, and I'm going to tell you what we're going to do.
Yes, we know that one.
And again, I think in some ways that has been the challenge. And so this kind of model, usually that we see in public comment processes, in planning commission meetings, city council meetings, and so on, really lead to broken public processes, broken relationships with the public, and traditionally public engagement is not a skill taught in policy or planning programs. This is certainly something that we're changing through the Davenport Institute as we actively train current public sector officials, but we also have it incorporated into our curriculum. And so a couple quick points I want to make, and this is something that I think those in government, as I highlighted at the beginning, are increasingly developing an awareness of. But it's very important for you to understand as citizens who are engaging the government what you want, okay? Because at its best, public engagement is really a spectrum of processes, right? And this is now looking from the government's perspective, but it can range from informing the public to consulting, incorporating feedback and designing options, I'm going to define these in a second, to actually empowering the public to make decisions within council or commission guidelines. And so to define each of those stages, informing is simply, again, what I call public engagement 1.0. I'm providing information to you as a government official. You need to know what it is. You might ask a question and answer, but the Q&A is not to inform me, it's to inform you. As we move down through the spectrum, we're looking at deeper elements of public engagement. So when we're talking about consulting, we're asking for the public feedback on a preset number of options. Here are the options that we have set on council or on staff, but we want to get your priorities if you saw these trade-offs. Incorporating is even a deeper level where you're engaging usually at a stakeholder level, the public to actually set those options Then you usually take those options then to the public for prioritization. And empowering is where you're asking the public to make the decision or solve the problem within council or commission guidelines. Again, usually in a blue ribbon panel or a stakeholder group type of process. Now this is the bleeding edge of public engagement, but you all probably know that California, we vote in voting districts set by 14 everyday Californians who constituted something called the California Redistricting Commission. We took a very political, very complex decision out of the hands of politicians in Sacramento. We turned it over to a group of 14 Californians, and we now vote in districts that were set by the public. Right? So this is an example of the empowering stage. So what makes this a leadership skill? And this is as you engage with your government officials, these are the kinds of questions and criteria I think are important to keep in mind. One is knowing when to engage and at what level of the spectrum. This is important for you to know as well. Because sometimes when you say the word public engagement and they hear the word public engagement, you can be talking two completely different languages. And those different languages usually center around a miscommunication at its best, a miscommunication about where you are on the spectrum. And I've seen so many public meetings fall apart where a government official very intentionally said, okay, we're going to engage the public now, and I'm going to tell you what to do. And then people have shown up saying, wait a minute. I thought this was called a town hall meeting, and in a town hall meeting, you're supposed to write things down and get my feedback, right? So being very intentional about where you sit on a particular policy issue, and when the government says, at whatever level, we want to hear from you, asking some of those diagnostic questions about what's really on the table from a policy perspective and what isn't, what's going to happen with this feedback, what's the plan, how are you going to stay in touch with me as someone who's participating in a public workshop of some sort, all these are important questions for you to ask. Knowing how to design a process that allows for some level of input, right? We have done a lot of work. We get calls often at the office in Malibu from cities around the state who want our help in consulting on a public process, and we ask them when the actual decision has to be made, and they'll say something like, oh, in the next month or so. And so our immediate question is, well, A, how quickly can we have a legitimate public workshop that's going to consider the opinions of the public, and how's that actually going to be understood and integrated by you all as policymakers, right? And so holding them accountable to that is really so important. Knowing who and at what level to involve. Is this something that needs to happen at a stakeholder level first before it happens with the broader public? What level of expertise do you all bring as residents that could be helpful to government in understanding the impact of their decisions on the policies that they are making? Knowing what and how much information that can help the discussion. Understanding the strengths and weaknesses of the governments that you're dealing with. Right? And this goes back to that survey question that we asked, where a good almost two-thirds of government officials that we surveyed said that they wondered whether they actually had the skills or talents on staff to facilitate a good public meeting. Some of these folks are really doing the best job they can. I know sometimes it doesn't seem that way, but some of them really are trying to, this is the model that they've been raised with. And so when we talk about facilitating a meeting where they actually have to take their hands off the wheel a little bit of the outcome of a process, this is something that is not so much now as things that really are changing, as I pointed to before, but something that is new to a lot, especially later generation public officials. Trusting the process is so important.
The later generation.
So I want to talk about just, and I'll close here with these two couple slides here. One is, I want to give you a window into the public sector training that I do. Again, we trained through Pepperdine 2,000 public sector officials in how to lead more effective public processes. And there's always one area of the session, these are usually half or full day training seminars that we lead. There's always one area of the session where all of a sudden all the light bulbs go on in the room. that they realized, I never really saw things in that way, but this really is a problem. And it's when we talk about customers and citizens. So, if you talk to most public sector officials, especially at the municipal level, they know somebody named Rick Cole. Rick Cole is the former city manager of Ventura, former mayor of Pasadena, and now he's my city manager in Santa Monica, which is where I live. And Rick wrote an article for Governing Magazine 15 years ago called Government as a Vending Machine. And he had gone to he had been a part of enough public meetings where somebody usually showed up at the public comment and said something like, "You need to do what I say because I pay your salary." And he heard that comment enough where he began to realize, we're not really trying to solve a problem here. I'm trying to address a specific person's need. And I'm being expected to address their need because they think they pay my salary. And what he began to realize was this really is how a customer talks, not how a citizen talks. Now, I'm not talking citizen in the legal sense. I'm talking about citizen in ways I'll describe in a second. But the citizen is one who takes an active role in solving public problems. Now, those in government sometimes are not very good at allowing this to happen. But also, I think what we have to acknowledge, I see it all the time. And again, I think the problem is not the public, it's not even necessarily the government, it's usually the way that we engage and speak to one another. That people will show up at public meetings and say, you need to do X because either I pay your salary or you serve me, without an awareness of all the trade-offs that are inherent in our democratic republic, especially at the local level. The reason I know this is because I live in the capital of these problems, Santa Monica, California. And a very quick story. One of the big policy issues that we faced in Santa Monica about 5 years ago was the building of a light rail, metro light rail, from the Culver City hub out to the Santa Monica, almost to the pier station. It was the rail to the sea, they called it. And for months of public comment at council meetings, whenever this issue was on the agenda, something like this would happen. And I saw enough of these meetings that I know this is what happened. The first person would get up to public comment and say, "Miss Mayor, the people of Santa Monica demand you stop building this light rail. It's going to cause all these problems along the Olympic Boulevard corridor. It's going to kick up all this dirt. It's going to really hurt the businesses that are there. It's going to bring a bunch of people into this city we really don't want. The people of Santa Monica demand you not build this light rail." The next person would get up, and the person would usually have a t-shirt that matched the 5 people behind them. And that person would say, "Miss Mayor, the people of Santa Monica demand you finish building this light rail. It's going to be great for getting cars off the road. It's going to be great for bringing people into our downtown businesses. It's going to be terrific for getting cars off the road. We all know that we have all these traffic congestion problems. The people of Santa Monica demand you finish building this light rail." Now, the people of Santa Monica demand you stop building the light rail, and the people of Santa Monica demand you finish building it. The people of Santa Monica are schizophrenic. And so there are trade-offs, but in that, it's a window into really the challenges that we have as citizens when our only point of connection is my 2 or 3 minutes at a microphone. I'm not actually engaging with anybody up there, nor am I actually engaging with my fellow citizens. And this is something that increasingly government officials understand, but is really at the heart of your work as a consultant to your government. This isn't just about you having government do something, it's about having them be conveners of a public discussion where all of you together as citizens of Newport can have a real conversation, beyond just the government telling you how smart they are and how stupid you might be. Because I think you all understand that in these issues related to SPON, there are real trade-offs here. right? And really one of the hardest job that people have in local government, I see it all the time, is they really do have a very hard time balancing the trade-offs. Economic, environmental, residential. How do we keep a sense of what Newport is, right? I mean, my mom, mother-in-law and father-in-law lived in Newport since '72. What they've seen in changes in this city, I mean, many of you probably have lived that same time. It is,
Why we're here.
it is amazing. And that's also why my mother and father-in-law don't live in Santa Monica anymore, which is where they lived before it. So convening conversations where citizens can talk to one another, it's not just you and the government, is so important. And so these customer characteristics, these citizen characteristics of being accountable, thinking more about the whole, understanding responsibility that we all have, and acknowledges that a sustainable change only happens through citizen participation. So, important point, and I just want to close with this, is it has been rare, and again, 2,000 people have gone through our training. It has been rare when a public official has said, once we talk through a process where citizens are actually talking to citizens, they know, by the way, they know the public comment process is broken. They know this. What you hope to be able to do is come alongside some of them and say, we actually do want to have public engagement that works, and we know that we can do something deep at a deeper level than simple public comment. And that earnestness on your part, you would be amazed at the kinds of responses you might get from those in government who also understand, just like you do, that the usual way that we talk to one another doesn't work. And so with that, I will turn it over to Jennifer.
Good afternoon. So my name is Jennifer Lilley, and what you heard in my introduction is that I currently work for the City of Brea. And after all that, I am feeling like the black hat in the room, which I'm becoming really accustomed to. What you don't know about me is actually, I began my career as an intern for the City of Brea during a time when we had a very visionary city manager and was doing work really, truly participatory with our citizens. And through that process, we envisioned Brea's future. Well, I was a young, doe-eyed planner who thought this is how it's supposed to work. But because I'm older in my profession, we didn't have planning schools that taught us what we were doing. Words like charrette, when I started working, were new. Imagine that. Nobody knew what it was. We had to explain to community members what a charrette was. And so I left the public sector after only a few years, and I decided I wanted to focus my career on community engagement. I wanted to learn the tools that these people knew, and I wanted to bring it to the government realm. Now there's great classes and universities that actually do this. Back in the day, I had to leave the planning world to go and learn from experts outside of our world to bring those tools to bear. So after 25 or 26 years in the private sector, actually providing training, much like Pete, not only to government agencies, but to community groups like yourself, I sold my company and came back to the public sector. And you may be wondering why, and actually sometimes, most of the time, I wonder why myself. But I really started seeing that this was a critical time in our government, in our local governments, where the divide between the community and the government agency had grown so big that, not saying I needed to solve the problem, but I needed to be part of the solution. I needed to bring the skills that I had learned and that I had been teaching others to communities that I could work for on the inside, and I could hopefully change the system from the inside out. So some of what I'm going to share with you today is kind of the secret playbook from the other side that we used to teach public agencies of how can you overcome some of these challenges and how can you get back to civil conversations. But I want to start with this, and not in a way to make you feel sorry for me, but maybe hopefully a little. When I walked into the door of City Hall, what no one could have told me, and I never anticipated, is that the minute that I sat at that desk and put on this name tag, instead of my 28 years of community engagement and being an expert in the industry, winning awards for wonderful participatory processes, the minute I walked in that door, I became the enemy. All of a sudden, I was incompetent. I didn't care about my citizens. I didn't want to talk to them, and I couldn't be trusted. Just by putting on this name badge, without anyone knowing who I was, what I was about, and what I was going to do. The minute I sit down at a table with the other side, that's the ammunition they bring to bear to the conversation. So before we can even talk about the issues, before we can even talk about a dialogue, the first hurdle I have to overcome is earning that trust. Really tough to do when you're starting out, that you're ignorant, that you don't want to participate, right? We're starting at a huge disadvantage. Had I known then what I know now, I don't know if I would have put down my consulting badge and put on a city badge, because it's such a difficult divide to cross. And it's so discouraging when there's some folks who have been so hurt by the process that they won't let it go. And they won't move forward with me to actually try to come to solutions. So, let me tell you a little bit about where this work has taken me. Because facilitation and community engagement bridges the gaps of all things, and we're here to talk about land use and government and all that good stuff, but I've gotten to do work with animal shelters. Crazy, I'm a planner. I don't do animal shelter stuff, but talk about passionate and emotional and problems that need to be solved, where citizens need to get together with government to come up with solutions. I've worked with foster care systems, I've worked with the healthcare system. I actually got to speak and work with a group of the legislature in Washington, D.C. on internet access for everyone. Again, outside of my realm of expertise, but these tools translate. Communication and engagement translates beyond local government or anything else, like we said earlier. So, I want to share with you a little bit of what I think both sides see as we walk into this process. And let's see if we'll get it done.
What I hear when I'm being yelled at is people caring loudly at me.
There are a few things I want to say about Laura Liddy. There is a disturbing lack of benches in Ramsey Park. I want to sit more.
I found a sandwich in one of your parks, and I want to know why it didn't have mayonnaise. What's so funny?
Oh. What are you, some kind of moron? Why don't you have hand dryers in the park bathrooms? They're so much more sanitary than paper towels. Anyone knows that.
Ham and mayonnaise.
No.
Ham and mayonnaise.
No.
Ham and mayonnaise. Except for turnip.
My daughter's 5.
Well, your daughter is an idiot. Your daughter is an idiot. Your daughter is an idiot.
No, she's not.
I made this in one of your pottery classes. It's terrible.
My bird is missing. I need a permit to post sign.
Let me just look for that form.
There's no time. He can fly. If the government shut down, who's going to stop Al-Qaeda?
But isn't all food bad for you? I've been eating lasagna and muffins every day of my life for 40 years, and I feel terrible.
How you like that?
You're holding coffee.
Now, why should the Bill of Rights be in the official time capsule, but this painting of my dog is in time capsule 7?
There's rocks in there.
There's a sign at Ramsey Park that says, "Do not drink the sprinkler water," so I made some tea with it, and now I Are you listening to me, sir? I'm talking to you. Sir,
Are these all actors?
are you aware that there is asbestos in the water system?
What's so bad about corn syrup? It's natural. Corn's a fruit. Syrup comes from a bush.
Oh, boy.
I'm not worried about swine flu. I already had the swine flu. I'm worried about the turtle flu.
Turtle fruit.
Oh, you You promised!
You promised? That's not fair.
Wait, it's not a question of fairness, it's
Go
separation.
back to Russia, Tommy.
And you go back to Russia! And you go back to wherever you came from!
What's next? Income?
Sir, you don't pay your income tax?
Whether or not I pay income tax is none of the government's business.
No, actually it is.
Well, you don't know my name or what I look like, so good luck finding me.
How do we know you're really a nurse?
I am, I promise. I work at St. Joe's.
Well, the point is, my friend thinks you're cute. Give me your number so we can have it. Can I have your email address? I just got on AOL.
No.
My dog went to one of your parks and ate another dog's feces, and I am going to sue you for that.
This that's happening here is not allowed.
Oh, shut up, Kelly! Make me, Bob!
Hey, these pretzels suck.
Is there going to be basketball there? Basketball courts attract undesirables to my community.
Why don't we just set fire to the past? Set it ablaze?
That's arson.
Well, let's leave that up to the lawyers. Point it.
So I think we get the point. So we come into these conversations and we have some biases in place, right? So as Pete laid out, a lot of government officials come out of a place of feeling like you guys are the enemy. And a lot of citizens come into the conversation feeling that the government officials are the enemy. And what I'm so glad Pete pointed out is what I like to believe is that the process is the enemy. Sometimes we have to live with the process we have, right? So in a democracy, in our local government, we have the public hearing. And albeit broken for two-way conversation, it is the process we have for the decision-making process. What I would hope that all of you have gotten to see somewhere in whatever community you've lived, maybe before Newport Beach, is that there's processes outside of that public hearing. That's not the time to negotiate. It's not set up for that, right? You get to come up to the podium, you speak for 3 minutes, they can't respond to your conversation, they either have to continue the item to talk about it and then come back to it later. It just strains out forever. It makes you feel like they're not listening, like they don't want to engage, and they're left with the laws and the rules that they have to follow. Broken process. So what I'm hoping to share with you today is some ideas of how to ask for what you want, which is to have a two-way conversation, which can't happen, we know, in that meeting format. So instead, let's ask for a different meeting. Let's not wait until we get to the decision-making process to have that two-way conversation. So I would like to, and have been working to empower communities all over the state of California to ask for what they want. And actually, most government agencies are happy to do it, because they also are restricted by those guidelines, by those laws, and how they have to engage with you. Now, I'm not going to be an apologist for all of those 2,000 that you originally said, and they all came up with very negative comments about the public. Most of them have come from very negative experiences, negative backgrounds, and they don't know the tools. They don't understand them. Like I said, they're people even sometimes older than me that grew up in a time where this wasn't taught in school. It wasn't part of their profession. And they really were taught to write zoning codes, read plans, and plan for cities. And yet they're being asked to engage with the public and solve problems and be forward-thinking and be visionary. Well, that's not in the tool book they were given. So for you to ask for the meetings that you want helps to manage the expectations, right? Because the expectation right now is that you're going to go to that public forum, you're going to speak for your 3 minutes, they're not going to talk back to you, and we can't move the conversation forward. But if we can ask for a meeting, much like this, where we can actually have a dialogue outside of those rules, it changes the dynamics. All of a sudden, we can have a two-way conversation. But the expectations are the expectations. So when you go to the city council meeting or the planning commission meeting, the expectation has to be, and it doesn't help the process to be frustrated by, I only get 3 minutes. It's the game we have to play in. So either we ask for a different game, or we play within the rules and we know that that's going to be as good as the game is going to be. In terms of the participants, I like to ask some questions in my own mind before a meeting. What's the history of the conversation that we're going to have? Because you can't just walk into it and think, okay, well, let's just hear what they have to say. there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes. As I said, I've only been back in Brea now for 3 years. People come into my office and they talk about 15 years ago, there was a planner who decided X, and that created the problems that we live in today. Well, I need to find out what that decision was that created the problems today, because I can't even understand what a solution would be until I understand how we got here, right? So same thing for you as citizens. The best game plan you can have is to know that history, but to try to know it from both sides. Why did the city make the decision? I love the question you asked in the very beginning, Jim, if I can pick on you, of why is that $1 million not in the budget? I don't know. I mean, we could all sit here and speculate, right? But I don't know. So ask them that question. That's so great. And then you know more about the history of how you're getting to the place that you're getting. And if it's terrible and wrong and illegal, then you know how you can deal with that. But if it's purposeful and insightful and something, I don't know what that could be, but wow, all of a sudden we're on a different path. Does that make sense? Who should be in the room? This to me is a big question. Oftentimes, and I said, go ask for the meeting you want. But as Pete mentioned, if you ask for the meeting you want and the wrong person's in the room, and are there any engineers here today? Okay, I'm really sorry, I'm going to pick on you just a tiny bit. And my son is actually studying to be an engineer, so I'll pick on him too. Oftentimes, they'll send in the engineer, right, to talk about traffic issues. Because the community is really unhappy about the traffic and why the lights don't change properly and what's going on. Most engineers, not all, most engineers are not the best at listening and being empathetic and communicating when it comes to technical conversations, right? Because there's a reason why that traffic light has to last as long as it does. And there's a reason why the road capacity is X, Y, and Z. And they want to share with you that information so you have the same context. And that can oftentimes feel defensive and like they're not listening and they're not really part of a two-way conversation. So having the right people in the room, you can have the engineer, but you also might want to have somebody else who kind of helps the conversation move past the technical and more to the root of the problem. Hope that wasn't too harsh on engineers. The other question, and I was at that same conference as Melanie, is what is the role of the people in the room? And I was so happy that one of the speakers talked about this. Oftentimes people will think that the Planning Commission or the City Council are attorneys in the meeting, right? They're fighting the case, if you will. Really their role is to be judges. They are to sit objectively, not have forming their own opinion about anything, even though they live in the communities they serve. And they're to take in all the information, all sides, like it was fresh and new information, and then come up and form a decision. If they come in ahead of time with their decision already made, which does happen from time to time, or if they only allow one side to dominate and share information and don't share both, they are not doing their job in a democratic system. But from a public's perspective, and I'm a citizen in my community too, and I can be very difficult on my city council or planning commission if they run awry of this, is you want them to hear you. And it can feel very frustrating when they're not understanding your point of view. But really seeing them in the role that they're meant to serve is so important and actually can help the process. The other important player to understand is staff's role. This is where I think sometimes we get a bad rap. Staff is meant to make a recommendation to your planning commission or your city council. And I get asked this all the time, and again, it was something that I now look back on and go, I never knew people were going to misunderstand this. People believe it's my opinion. And they want me to tell them my opinion. Well, what do you think about this development? Or what do you like about this or that? I don't get to have an opinion. I am the technical expert. My job is to be on the witness stand and provide the technical expertise that my judges, my decision makers need to make the best decision in the process. But it's only on that. I don't get to have a voice of, I really like purple flowers, or I really like, large sidewalks. Now I can tell them why large sidewalks are better, or why they meet the code better than a narrower sidewalk. But I can't say my personal preference is for, a 4-foot wide sidewalk. It's just not allowed. But people hear that word recommendation, and they begin to believe that I'm giving my personal opinion. And so staff oftentimes wears the hats as being against the public. Because we'll say, we're recommending for that 27,000 square foot, 10-story building to be right on the corner next to your home. And you're going, well, darn it, that's a terrible recommendation. They're bad people. But I don't have any tool to tell me it's a bad building, bad decision. I can only use my general plan, my zoning code, and the law. The council gets to take in your opinion. You all are to provide the context, the community values, and the history of your community. That's what you bring to the table. And what else is broken in this process is that oftentimes people don't show up at the meeting, right? So they're only hearing from a few folks and they're missing some of that context. And that's really unfortunate. And oftentimes decision makers kind of paint the public as being apathetic. That's why they don't come to meetings. Well, I'm going to tell you, I think people don't come to meetings because meetings don't work. And it's not out of apathy, it's out of frustration. And the other side is we're not engaging with people in the way that they want to, so it's not a priority in their very busy lives, right? And we're spending a lot of time trying to do this, but it still ends up in the same process that's broken. So understanding those roles and even your role in the process, people will call me all the time, applicants will say, should I bring 100 people, should I bring 10 people? Frankly, it doesn't matter. If you bring 100 people and they only say the same thing, 100 people aren't adding to the conversation, and sometimes it can be distracting. But if you bring 10 really qualified, great speakers who make the points and provide the context, well, that's impacting. But it can go the other way too. 100 speakers with different perspectives, different points can win the day. So understanding those the participants' role is really important in the process. I'm going to skip ahead because I'm going over, I think. Let me get into a little bit of the timeline. I think what's really important, because again, oftentimes by the time you get to a public hearing, it was kind of your point, Pete, of gosh, this decision has to be made in 6 weeks, so let's engage the public now. I think what's kind of missed in the public's request to a public agency is to take a step back. We just had it this week. I won't give any specific examples, but we hear from people, something gets printed in the paper, and I get a phone call, you've already made a decision, this is already a done deal, rubber stamp, it hasn't even had a public hearing, how can this happen? Well, first of all, I don't control the media, and I don't control property owners. And sometimes property owners print things in the paper because they want investors to have confidence in a plan that they have. They want to invite other people to come to their property. And so they do media things for all sorts of reasons, but not always in connection with the city. But somehow we get the responsibility of we should have known, we shouldn't have let it happen, and we've let the public down. At that point, I would love if my community called me instead and said, when is the meeting on this topic? Not the public hearing. When are we going to have a meeting on this? Now, in this particular case, I would say to them, I still don't have an application. I don't even know what we're talking about yet. But as soon as I do, I'm going to schedule that meeting. For me, I want my community to meet on a topic, whatever it is, big or small, early in the process. I tell my applicants, I have one in the room, sorry, I keep subconsciously pointing over there. I tell them consistently, you need to go out in the very beginning, before your plans are drawn, and talk to the community. Understand, what are the concerns? Yes. Don't assume, well, we know it's going to be traffic, it's going to be, no. Go talk to them and find out. If we can get to that point, we can have a better conversation. So, making things clear, understanding that timeline, and not just coming to the public hearing at the very end and raising frustration for not being a part of that process. But when you start having concerns in the beginning, when that piece goes in the newspaper, that's the time to start asking, what's the timeline? Where is this heading? When do we get to be involved? If you have a community that wants to engage you, they'll be happy to give you that roadmap so that you can be part of the process. Or they'll come to Pete's training. How many of you are professional public speakers?
Because we get paid, or is that we do it a lot?
You do it a lot, you feel really skilled and excellent, this is a place you excel. Okay, good, a few, yay.
Yeah, I want to do that.
Most people are not. Most people get up to the podium, and it sometimes is their first time ever speaking in front of a public hearing. Most public hearings are now televised. That adds a different level of pressure and nerves. Sometimes on heated topics, we have a lot of people in the audience speaking in front of big crowds can change this. So I'm giving you some tips on how to be more effective. So first of all, understand that it's a nerve-wracking process, right? Your body has some physiological things that it just does without you even knowing. And sometimes that distracts you as a speaker. And so you might get up to the podium and I don't know, one of those things is saying And what that's actually doing is it's your brain trying to breathe. When we get up in front of people and we try to speak, we don't often take good breaths. And so the word is our brain's way of trying to get a little pause in our speaking to breathe. But what the speaker thinks is, oh shoot, I just said 5 times. Now my brain is distracted not to say the word which also makes it so I'm not breathing, which makes it so that sometimes speakers feel like they're going to pass out. So what I want you to do when you get up to that podium, if you have paper, I saw you, put that paper down. Because if your eyes start to see your paper shaking, it sends a signal to the brain that you are under attack. And it's going to make your heart rate go higher, it's going to make you breathe less, and it's going to make you more nervous. So set the paper down, stand nice and firm, planted, and the very first thing you're going to want to do is take a nice, deep breath. And as soon as you start noticing you're either saying or you're losing your train of thought, take another deep breath. Because all of those distractions is your body trying to help you under this attack of having to speak in public, which really it feels like, right? That fight or flight moment. Planning for the unexpected. In a group like this, and I'm hoping that you're going to have more conversations in settings like this rather than in your city council or planning commission meetings. You want to make sure that you're planning for the unexpected. We've had meetings with community groups where there's been no air conditioning. My worst experience ever was we had an environmental impact report that we were doing a scoping meeting for in one of my communities in the San Gabriel Valley. And they planned it at the local elementary school. That sounded good, right? Nice and close to your homes. It was in the kindergarten classroom. In August, no air conditioning. The chairs in the room were this big, nothing else. And the room held about 30 people, maybe. And we had about 150. Wow. So the minute I walk in the room, I'm like, okay, what's my backup plan? I need a different room. I need to find fans if I have to go rent them at Home Depot. What can I do to make this meeting more comfortable? Because I tell you, guaranteed now, and this is how what I've heard now as a public official is they did it on purpose. Oh. They put us in that room on purpose so we'd be uncomfortable, so people wouldn't stay. And sometimes it's just what happens, right? And the public officials that get invited to your meetings, when some snafu happens where their PowerPoint doesn't work or the sound cuts out, they could think you did it on purpose so that we couldn't communicate clearly, so there wasn't good dialogue. So plan for those things. Try to make it so everyone feels comfortable so we don't get in those situations where we start to get frustrated and attacking with one another. I really want to hopefully focus on this. If I leave you with anything, it's how to move the conversation forward. And I think that's why you all are here. You want to be heard, and you want to hear others as well. And so the first thing, if I can recommend anything, and I know it's hard to do, is to come out of the trench. If you're in a trench, you may not be. But hopefully, as we're training public officials, they come out of the trench too. It's so frustrating for me to hear in my own organization or in those that I trained before, oh, it's those people, they always think that. Well, of course they do. They live under the flight of airplanes. They're going to think it's noisy. So let's move past that frustrated trench and let's start to listen again. So step one, come out of the trench. Step two is to wave the white flag. Sometimes you're going to have to be the bigger person and say, I know it's been frustrating. I know we've been at odds. Can we start a conversation? I'm going to put down my weapons, whatever those are. But you're going to ask the other side to do that as well. And so those two things have to work together. And the last thing that I'm hopeful, whenever you want to come to a two-way conversation, you remember, is not just to seek to be understood on your side, but also to seek to understand the other side. And to me, that is the best way to keep that conversation moving forward. You don't have to agree. You don't have to buy into what they're telling you, but to understand why it is they've come to the decision or the way of thinking that they have. And to me, that's part of that mutual respect for the civil conversation to move forward. So I'm going to end there, hopefully a couple minutes early. There's a lot more. I know Pete had a lot more as well, but what we really wanted to do was hold this last bit of space for more of a, we're talking about two-way conversations, right? So more of a two-way conversation. What is it that's burning in your minds that you wanted to talk about today? And hopefully between the two of us, we can give you some good feedback and some tips and tricks along the way. You want me to go?
Yeah.
All right, so first hand up was right
Well,
in the
it's
center.
my observation that it is not the staff in Newport Beach that's the problem. It's the mindset of the elected officials. And the problem with that is that they don't see themselves as public servants. They do not also recognize that their citizens are, and most public officials forget this, that the citizens are better educated than they were previously, so their expectations are higher. So as leaders, they've got to be 5 steps ahead of them, and they're not, so that they get their backs up and dig in, and then they become very defensive, and then they lose their cool. Some of them shouldn't be there simply because they don't have the right mindset. And I'm sorry, but I do think that you are public servants. I'm of the school that Emanuel Swedenborg was, who was a member of the Swedish Parliament, put there by the king after he had solved the problems of the Swedish mines. And he wrote that the highest vocation you can have is public service. And I ascribe to that. And when I don't see that happening, it really makes me upset. So after 38 years of being in 4 different elected positions, I get upset a lot when I see that. And I get rather brutal. What happened here was they hijacked the city council, okay, and came from the idea that now I've got a power base, I can hit you over the head with it. And that's what they do on a pretty regular basis. Now, they're getting smarter because they're talking the right talk often, and you gotta really watch what they're doing rather than just what they're saying. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, I would just say on that I've worked, we do a lot of training, but we also do consulting with cities on some of these issues. And sometimes it's been the case where we have been brought in to work with the city because there has been a change in one of the council members. That's actually happened fairly recently where there were some issues around building ordinances, and there were several neighborhoods that really did not want further construction in their area. They had a particular council member who they did not believe represented their interests. They brought in another one, And it was that new council member who reached out to us to say, we'd like to have a better public meeting around this issue. I think as much as I mentioned in my slides that this new perspective towards public engagement is being had by staff, I think increasingly you're beginning to see it with electeds as well. Now, some of the elected see it as a way to curry favor and, shake hands and kiss babies and you're there and I'm here and everything's fine. But I would say that given our current system of government, if your challenges are at the council level, you either have the choice to build relationships with those in staff who can be supportive of a good public process, or...
Well, no, you put staff, in this instance, you would put staff next on the chopping block. No.
Well,
These are not people that are understanding. They're people that say, everybody else's head will roll, mine will be last.
Right. And so then I would say that, given our system of government, if there aren't changes in the electeds, there is not going to be changes on these issues.
And I think that's a great point, actually. I mean, we can do great training of our citizens, and we can do great training of our staff, the folks that are in the trenches working with you. But what we need today, I'm saying this on camera, what we need today is leadership. And unfortunately, what a lot of politicians, just in general, sorry, I should ask, are there any politicians in the room? They're about getting elected, right? And in order to get elected, you need to have people vote for you. And it's kind of like being a good parent. You can't please your kids all the time. You have to say no, and hopefully you do it in a way that you can explain why, and they can agree that I don't like it, but I'll go along with it. But what politicians don't love doing, and especially in this world of social media and communication gone awry, in my opinion, they don't want to say no to anybody. And so oftentimes it's left to staff, oftentimes it's left to the public process to duke it out, and it just furthers this divide. So it's a great point you raise. I don't know that we've got great solutions, except I would be calling for leadership. What's our vision? You guys are working on a general plan amendment. That's great. That's a vision. Once you have that, if they pay for it, we'll see. I'd be asking, are we following this vision? Does this decision support this vision? Does this support what the community's decided?
I'm an elected, or was, so could I just sort of offer a little bit of maybe a suggestion here, which is that we come in, we haven't been to a school of public policy. And the only training we get is ethics training, which may surprise people. But I'm sitting here and thinking, how about, we're not going to send our council members probably wouldn't agree to go to a week-long training session. But even to have a couple of hours of how to deal better with the public, I think would be invaluable. And if we had it at the very beginning of our terms, we might be able to eliminate a lot of our problems. We can't train all of our residents, but we can certainly train the 7 people that we've elected. And I think that would be something that we, as a group, we could recommend and would be invaluable. To have people like you come down and just
So leave your
I
card.
would love for you guys to talk to us. I would love for you guys for our city council to hear this, just this.
Yes,
I would love
it's gonna be on.
Well, and we've done training with the National League of Cities. We've done trainings with electeds. I know that you've worked with electeds as well. But I think it is fair to say that the majority of the work being done now on training and education is with staff versus electeds. And you're right, because the vast majority of electeds, this is the not intended to be full-time job. It's really a full-time job, right? And so we're actually in conversations with the League of California Cities as well about finding ways to introduce this into some of their new council member training.
The only thing I'd add, thank you so much for that comment, is that you actually can train your citizens as well. And I know cities like Anaheim, we're starting this in Brea, are doing citizens academies, where much like CERT, you go through these different topics, how to engage with the public, how to engage, and the public, how to engage with your government, how to speak in public, what does the policeman do, how to talk to them differently. So if that's not something you have here, it's certainly something you might want to raise up to your city manager or your decision makers as well. And in the back, and then there was somebody else.
I'm gonna give you a scenario that I'd like you to comment on, and then I'll follow up with a question you can handle both at the same time. So, stand up in front of the this is regarding the public comment exchange. Stand up in front of the public comment, basically point out very specifically on numerous times where the city is out of compliance with their general plan. This is about general plan here. You're out of it, here's where you're out of it. This, and this. So there's actually pointing it out. This is the response. The council member, be it the mayor or whoever wants to address it, turns to the staff and says to the staff, are we in compliance? Staff says, yes, we are in compliance. Next. That's happened multiple times. And so that's a frustrating scenario that I think demonstrates that you may or may not want to comment on. But I do have a question for you. And the question is, where do committees fall in? Because we have, in Newport Beach, we have some good committees made up of citizens. I'm biased, I'm on one of them. But we have commissions and committees. In some cases, like the Arts Commission, it's very close to how a committee, but we make recommendations to the council. And they're chaired by council members, so there's a direct connection to that. So where do they fit in? Because you made no mention of those in your communication scenarios.
Should we tackle the general plan first?
Yeah.
That is a good comment.
No, I appreciate that, because it's what we get challenged with, right? As a city planner, that's my Bible, if you will. That's the document I go to, and I tell my planning commission, based on this application, this is how it meets the general plan, and this is how it doesn't. But let's be real. It is a very general document. That's the name, general plan. And in some cities, how old's your general plan?
Sorry?
06.
06, but
okay, that's not
it
terrible.
had a lot of changes.
But in some cities, you could be looking at a general plan that's 30, 35 years old. And in these budget times, that may be the best you're going to get. And so one of the things that I would encourage, again, is that dialogue about your general plan. We just completed in Brea a 2-year process of what is the community's values? Where do we see those values applying over the next several years? It's not a general plan update. We're not doing that yet. But first, we just want to start with, are we a city of growth? Are we not? Are we a city that's going to be more urban? Are we not? I just need to know those questions answered by my community so that when I, as the city planner, look at my general plan and I read those very general terms, I'm going to apply those values that I hear from the community. Not to people, but the community. Right? So in terms of that, that's just a little bit of, that general plan is both your savior and your curse, because as I read it, you read it differently. And so I will support your staff by saying they are being honest if they're saying you're in compliance, because they have direction to read it this way. You may believe they're out of compliance because you are reading it that way. It doesn't make either of you wrong, but what it tells me is 2 things. 1, you got to have a dialogue about your general plan, and 2, whatever the topic was, that dialogue should have been happening before you were in a public hearing talking about the general plan.
Which is kind of my other question about commissions and committees.
Well, again, so yeah, I'm a huge fan of commissions and committees as formal points of engagement with government in a couple different ways. One is that they're always tasked with a particular policy area. And secondly, as you said, there's usually a point of connection with an actual council member. And so depending on what those councils and commissions are, and all cities have different ones, I think we have at least 15 of them in Santa Monica. You know, they can be places where actual policy decisions are formulated. They may be finalized at council, or they may be finalized by staff, but they can be real points of influence. And frankly, most of them go untended. Right? Most of them have openings. In fact, I have a friend of mine who launched a new web platform called runforoffice.org that lists all the open commission and committee positions in local governments around California. And there are thousands of them. And so even in a city that's pretty well engaged like Santa Monica is, we have a number of our councils and committees that are not fully staffed.
My tip that I will share on commissions and committees, and you guys are all on your committee here, use your staff. And if you don't have a relationship or feel like your staff is able to engage with you, go find other technical experts outside of your city. Because the biggest challenge, I think, for commissioners, it's like we talked about in each layer of who's in the room, you're not trained for this. So to talk about a general plan, to talk about CEQA, to talk about some of these very technical things in a room with others that are technical experts puts you at an immediate disadvantage. I have a wonderful commissioner who meets with me on a regular basis, I will not say who, and comes in and asks questions about the general plan, which she's read thoroughly, talks about the environmental document that she's reading and flags it and says, now, wait a minute, where did this come from and how come? It's amazing to have, as a staff person, a commissioner who will say, I don't understand this, which in layman's terms says, I don't agree. So to me, it's okay, tell me what you don't understand. I'll explain it. If you still don't agree, I'm not trying to convince you of anything, but to have the dialogue to be able to explain why I see it or why it's in that document, invaluable. So if you don't have staff that you can do that with, go find staff elsewhere. It is part of our professional code for those of us in the industry who have AICP behind our name to volunteer our time to both upcoming practitioners and to our communities. So if you get a technical expert who won't help, they're not necessarily a very diligent technical expert. So reach out and use those resources that are available. Go here, and I did see a hand here, I don't want to forget you, so let me take you.
So I think that most of us in the room, I'm speaking kind of generally, would say that our general plan is old, and it's essentially built out, not completely, but, you know, and what's coming forward are developments that are very different than what we've seen. So they're putting a lot of commercial stuff by the airport, high-rise stuff. They're trying to do, it came forward in Fashion Islands. And so it changes how this community is. To me, and I think to a lot of people in the room, we want to see all that done as part of a general plan. We want to see a general plan update. How, any suggestions to you guys for how do we convince or talk to our council people about why this is important and how do we get them to do that, or any suggestions? Besides voting them out, that's another way of dealing with it. But is there any suggestions to doing that? Because I think that we need that to allow these developments along the Mariners Mile or the airport or Fashion Island or whatever it is. But we want to see the whole thing dealt with as a whole before you start doing all this little piecemeal stuff.
So I'm going to give you a practitioner's tip. Great idea, wrong tool, in my opinion. The general plan is not the be-all, end-all, and it's not the only time you can have that conversation about what you want to see. The problem, if you ask, so people tend to answer the question they're asked. So if you went to your decision makers or your city manager and said, we need to do this general plan update, we need to start talking to you about our vision for the future before any of this can happen, the reality of that is that's a 2+ year process. And I can't tell those private developers to just wait. I mean, I could, right? I could put a moratorium on the city, but nobody's going to do that. So, right idea, wrong tool. You don't need to wait for your general plan to be updated, to have a dialogue about what you see and why you see it and where it needs to go. So what you need to ask for is that. Again, in Brea, we had this vision and values, and we came up with this great thing that's going to lead to an update to our general plan. But in the meantime, we started getting development applications in and around our downtown. So my community, same thing. Wait a minute, before all this happens, don't we need to update? And no, I mean we do, but we don't have to wait. We can actually have that discussion now. We're going to be talking about floating zones. We're going to be talking about specific plans. There are a lot of tools in the city's toolbox to help implement a vision today instead of waiting on the general plan. So what the tool is that you want is the conversation.
Yeah, you're right.
But if you ask the question about the general plan as a practitioner, we're gonna answer the question about the general plan. And it's not gonna be the answer that you want, and it's gonna just frustrate you all even more.
Yeah, and again, as has been mentioned, there is so much wiggle room in most general plans.
That's,
At the same time, I think it is a lot of the public processes I work on, the tension, especially in planning issues, is not about the technicalities, it's about the aesthetics and a feeling that our policymakers don't understand what makes this place unique to me. And I have something, I'm not going to take a magic marker to these screens, but usually at some point, okay. This to me, you all ready to get a 2-minute master's in public policy?
Yes.
All right, this is your 2-minute master's in public policy. Public policy can seem very complicated, and especially when it relates to planning issues and land use. There are a lot of technical terms. But really, all public policy can be fit inside a box. It's what I call the policy box, your 2-minute master's in public policy. Ready? Every public policy fits inside a box. The top is the goal. What is the goal of the policy? Are we trying to increase educational outcomes? Are we trying to reduce recidivism? Are we trying to improve or decrease greenhouse gases? Every policy has a particular goal. Every policy has a certain budget and timeline associated with it. We have this much budget we can dedicate to it, and we have this much time under which we need to accomplish this goal. This side is the regulatory environment, and that can be anything from local ordinances all the way up to the United States Constitution. All good policymakers should know these. All good planners should know these. What they don't know is the bottom part of the box. And they shouldn't always be expected to know it, by the way. The bottom part of the box is history and culture. Now, this bottom, what I call the fourth side of the box, is the slider. So depending on whatever policy issue that you're thinking about, depending if this is your allocated goal, regulatory, time, budget, and history, it doesn't really matter whether you decide an answer here or an answer here or an answer here. The problem is most policymakers don't always understand that actually because of the history and culture of our community, really we only have this much room. And so if you come to me with an answer here that may have worked in Brea, it's not going to work here in Newport, sorry. It may have worked in Santa Monica, it's not going to work here in Fresno, sorry. Because this bottom part, this history and culture, is the driver that really does determine all these things can remain constant, but this one is always shifting. And here's the thing, folks. It may be shifting in the same city over time, right? And so the reason we want to have good public process, and the reason the good policymakers increasingly want good public process, is because, as to the point that Jennifer made, they don't necessarily know what the time and what the history and culture is of the places that they're working, right? And so if you're doing this job well, especially as it relates to issues around what is our downtown going to look like? How are we going to be as a, these very visceral questions that, yes, have technical aspects to them, but really this is always the driver, right? That for the policymakers that really do understand that this is the variable, a good public process will unearth that. And really that's why your engagement is so important in these kinds of public processes. And the variables that you talked about with the general plan, this is something that may vary again over time. That the answers that worked 20 years ago when this place was looking to grow, we're a different town now. But at the same time, there are still things that we value so deeply about living here. I have to tell you, I just facilitated a public process around building ordinance in Malibu. And that's a city, especially those that have lived in that town for over 20 years, still sees itself as a Sleepy Beach community that has, PCH is Main Street. And you probably know all the changes that have happened there. Just all the huge designers and, you know, the retailers that come in there that wanna just have a Malibu store and don't care whether they make $20 a year on it. They wanna be able to say that they've got a store in Malibu. And so Whole Foods came in there and said, oh, total fit, Whole Foods, you know, we're very much in keeping with the progressive nature of Malibu. Boom, that was not going to happen. And again, it took the planning department also understanding that when people came to the meetings, they were not just being anti this, they were being pro something. They were being pro, this is what I love about this place. And if you're not listening to me, then you don't care about it. And I understand that it fits these other parts of your box, but unless you know this, you're not really representing me. Now, here's what the smart policymaker does. The smart policymaker can take change and fit it into the history and culture of who you are. Not come out here, not go down there, still fit within the box. But the best policymakers are ones that say there is still going to be change here, but I understand that it still needs to fit within the history and culture of what makes this city unique. But that, I think, only happens effectively at well-facilitated public meetings. So now you all have MPPs.
Yay. Yeah, good. I promise to stay right here. I come back to
I'm
this.
actually have questions regarding public meetings, because the city planners did try to do something in response to our request not too long ago. But it turned out to be a meeting where they just described what they were doing and who was doing it. I mean, I said to them afterwards, could we not have a meeting with circular chairs, and then we can all be looking at each other and have some back and forth. So I don't know how, I mean, that's the process we were working on, but the main question I wanted to ask you, I mean, I'm working on that still, but the main question I wanted to ask you, we are also told by the city council, we want to do, and we think we're doing what the public want, what the residents want, but the thing is, we only get 100 people show up at the meetings, and how do we know that's what the rest of them want? We hear that all the time. What do we do about that? I mean, we actually have won a couple of elections big, and we did a referendum, and was successful, and, you know, a couple of elections that were surprised them, so that does give them some clue. But what else, what do you do with them when you have them
That
say?
numbers game is a big deal. I keep talking about our Brea Envisions effort, right? Community-wide, 2-year effort, and staff was, excuse me, damned if we did, damned if we didn't, right? So from the politician's perspective, it was go get more. That's why it stretched out for 2 years. You don't have enough people yet. We haven't heard from all of the community. At one point, we had over 750 participants. I don't know about most processes that you've been involved in, but that's way more than the 25 that normally show up.
Yes.
From the public's perspective, those 750 aren't all my neighbors, so we couldn't do enough. So we went further. It was already built in the process, but we went further when all the process was said and done, and to your point earlier about commissions and committees, we had a committee that was meant to represent the community. At one point in time, we literally let the consultant go, and the committee ran the process. Not only did they run the process, they reviewed all the data, they sorted through it all, they presented it to us as staff and said these were the findings, and they wrote the report. It still was criticized on both sides. The community was speaking. So we went one further and we brought in an objective source that did a statistically valid survey that took all of the outcomes of that vision plan and tested it in the community through all these statistics that say if we take this sample, if we do it random, if we do it this time of year, if we whatever, it will be valid within a 1-point margin of error. Nothing that came out of that survey was different than the vision plan. So it has proven through mathematics and science that what those 750 people said represented the 43,000 people in our community still criticized. So My point in that very elaborate explanation is you can have all of the best pieces of the ingredients to make the best dinner, and somebody still may not like it. And so in your case, I don't know what the answer is, because the number you will get at a meeting will never be good enough for whatever side isn't getting their way.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it gets back to, what's the goal?
Yeah.
Is the goal to solve traffic? Well, then maybe, just maybe, building homes is going to solve traffic. And if I don't want anything new to be built, but I come in with the goal of I want to solve traffic, well, I'm going to listen to the traffic engineer who tells me why building homes will help. I still may not like that we're going to have to build homes, but now all of a sudden, I'm moving closer to my goal of solving traffic, so I might be willing to accept some homes being built.
That's a great point.
Right?
Yeah.
And the person who wants to build homes everywhere needs to listen to my point of, but isn't building homes everywhere going to make more traffic? So how do you resolve that person who wants to build homes everywhere? Do you see how that dialogue is different than if 100 people believe that new homes are bad, then we should vote with them? To me, that's the wrong question.
Yeah.
The question is, if we're all about solving traffic, what are the steps that we're going to take to do that? Focus on that goal, and that's going to get you even to your community's value, and it's going to let you move the conversation forward.
This is such a great point, by the way, and it works both ways too, right? I mean, one of the toughest processes I worked on was with a community not far from Malibu, and it was a great sexy issue of septic ordinance. And what the building department knew was that there were parts of this city, about 40,000 population city, that stretched across areas almost to the coast and then back inland a little bit, but there were some areas that were still on septic. And they thought, for various environmental reasons, that they really needed to put everyone on a common sewer. About 70% of the city was already on sewer. They wanted to put these other neighborhoods on sewer. And so from an environmental perspective, the buildings department, planning department said, this is the way we're gonna go. It's really good for the environment. This is the way we need to move forward. But when people from those communities showed up, they were thinking one thing. You probably know what it is.
Money.
But specifically, sewer means develop.
Oh, yeah.
Now, from the building department, again, what is the goal here, right? The goal on one side was, this needs to be taken into consideration for an environmental impact. Some of this issues, without belaboring the point, where the septic neighborhoods were flowing into Malibu Creek that was going down the beach, which made the Surfrider Beach one of the most polluted beaches in all of California. But they were thinking from an environmental perspective, this is a smart thing to do, but from the community standpoint, this was all about, you're gonna start putting up homes when this starts happening, and you're really gonna fundamentally change what we're about. And so understanding what the goal is, both from the community standpoint, but also understanding, from the policymaker standpoint, what the goals are, and having a common understanding of what's going to get you to that goal is really so important.
We'll have time for one more question.
I'm sorry.
I'm curious because my observation of our city council and our city is that they're really numbers people. They're not people. Okay? And so, this fiscal responsibility is kind of like this hammer over everybody's head. And so I'm wondering how to reach them for people issues. I mean, how would you reach somebody like that on people issues?
Could you be just
Culture.
specific about how the fiscal responsibility is disconnected from a people issue?
How official responsibility?
How fiscal?
Fiscal.
You mentioned the fiscal responsibility.
No, I just said that's a mindset, so that would always take precedent over any kind of cultural issue or anything like that.
So
Where the money
regardless
is
what the
coming
community
from.
want, if there's not money for it, it doesn't happen.
Right.
So for example, we get developer fees, and now they're using it as part of the budget to
We'd have to
do
give up
the extra
developer
things.
fees. We'd have to give up developer fees.
I know.
they don't want to give up, they're addicted to developer fees.
But to balance the budget, not necessarily for services and other things.
Well, it's for other services, but it's
That's how
a,
they pay
it's a
for that kind of
mindset.
stuff, yeah.
Right.
Goals.
It's a mindset rather than,
Yeah.
yeah.
For me, I mean, this drives my life, right? When I walk into my office every day, when a problem walks across my desk, when I'm sitting in a meeting with an applicant, what's the goal? What are we trying to do? The goal is never get this application approved. The goal is never make all of you happy. I mean, I'd love that that was it, right? But you think something different than you think. So clearly I can't meet that goal as it is. But I need to ask myself, what's the goal of this issue? So you bring up some competing goals, right? And I'm so glad it's such a part of our culture right now of why we're at the odds that we're at. There is a financial crisis in City Hall across the state. And we won't get into it today, I promise, but we all know many of the aspects of what that means. And so one of the goals that cities are looking at is, how do we stay solvent to provide the services that you all want, which is oftentimes and can be in conflict with, as you said, some of your community values, because development can pay for that, but what the community doesn't know is actually development isn't achieving this goal of staying solvent, because with development comes ongoing costs.
Generation of services.
Right.
It is a vicious circle.
It can be. And so if that's the only solution to that goal, that's not the right solution, right? But what we lose track of sometimes is, what's the goal? So right now it's just, how do I bridge that budget gap? Or how do I make you happy? Or how do I get you out of my office because you're mad at me, right? And so I need to step back and ask myself, what is my goal? What am I trying to accomplish? And so to me, with your question, what I love about it is, how do I reach them? Thank you for asking that. To me, I would ask them, what's their goal? What are they trying to accomplish? So if it's solving right now, the only goal I have in Newport Beach is solving the budget. Well, tell me more about that goal. And how do you think the decisions that you're making, literally, I just want to know, how do you think the decisions that you're making are solving for that goal? That would be a way to reach them. And then share, right, that seek to understand and be understood. Can I share with you why I think that goal isn't going to be met? Just want to give you another side of the coin, right? That's a great two-way dialogue all of a sudden. Instead of no, but I got to meet this goal, now we're at odds and we can't talk. So, I don't know if you've got
I really don't have much to add to that, other than to say that this vicious cycle that you point out, sir, is worth naming, right? Because in some ways what you're talking about as well is putting things on future generations. You know, there is, I'm going to, let me turn the camera. There's something that I found works with every city council member. Ready for this? I'll never forget, I worked on a public budgeting process for a city on the Central Coast. I'm not going to say what it is, but it rhymes with Bolinas. They had a $20 million deficit on a $100 million general fund. This was in 2009. It was just a complete mess. And we brought in an outside facilitator. The mayor brought us in, and we started holding these budget workshops. The facilitator had a specific process that had you look at 4 visions of the future for your city, and each had different revenue raising and also service delivery options to it. And it was a way to have the public understand a very complex document, in this case, the city budget. And I'll never forget the first workshop that we did. It was at a community college, and we had 3 hours. The first 45 minutes was just kind of learning about your budget, and that was really about wrestling through these trade-offs. What we can do to raise revenues, to lower costs, so on. And we get to the end of it, and in the last few minutes, the facilitator, who's a friend of mine to this day, turns to the audience and just says, I just would love to get your feedback on what you thought about today. I understand that this is the first time you've ever engaged with government like this, where you're actually talking with one another and then reporting out, and the mayor is here, and one of the council members, and the city manager, and so on. And I'll never forget this. A woman stood up at one of the tables and said, you know, I thought this was great. I've never spoken with my neighbors in an environment like this where we're talking about real policy issues. I have a new understanding of really what the trade-offs are. But I have to tell you, I really don't care